If you are enjoying this podcast and other podcasts on the Dragon Wagon Radio Network, be sure to check out the Dragon Wagon Shop. Awesome t-shirts and mugs from your favorite shows so you can tout your podcast pride, all while supporting your favorite indie podcast network. And make sure to check it often for new items and limited time designs. So shop now at dragonwagonshop.com and get your dragon swag on. It's the greatest mystery in literary history. A divisive question with highly contested answers. Who was the writer behind the pen name William Shakespeare? Welcome to Don't Quill the Messenger. Here's your host, Stephen Sable.
Welcome. Today we're going to talk about death and dying. Well, in a manner of speaking, anyway. We're going to talk about last wills and testaments. In particular, we're going to talk about the last will and testament of William Shakspere of Stratford upon Avon. Is it the will of the person who wrote the works that have been attributed to William Shakespeare? We're going to explore that topic today with our special guests, Professor Dawn Rubin and Bonner Miller Cutting, one of the world's leading experts on Elizabethan wills, and she has studied some 3,000 different wills from the period.
I've always been curious, how does Mr. Shakspere of Stratford's will compare with the other 2,999 wills that you've read?
Shakespeare's will was a very startling shock to me because the Orthodox, we call them the Orthodox, you can call them the English professoriate or whatever fancy words you want to, but they tell you that his will is just characteristic of the time. That is the standard thing. Actually, it's not. When I read through all these thousands of wills, and by the way, the summer I did that was right at 10 years ago in 2008, and I drove my husband crazy. I had piles of Xerox wills, and I went to the local research library at a university nearby that happened to have a lot of wills, and I read through them, and I made Xerox copies of them, and I just had all this stuff all over the place. But this is the point. His will is a terribly inferior will to what reasonable people did. And it is so very different, and it is so very, and I'll use that word again, inferior, and very unlike, very uncharacteristic in that it is very slovenly looking. It is miserably worded. It's poorly composed. And the more I studied it, particularly in comparison to ordinary people, many people who were probably illiterate could write better wills and dictate better wills.
Well, wait a second. You're talking about William Shakespeare, the great William Shakespeare. Doesn't this will prove that he's the greatest writer in the world?
Do they still include his will in new editions of the complete works of William Shakespeare? 'Cause some volumes will give you the complete works of William Shakespeare, and
including
at the very
the
end,
will.
they'll include the will as one of his works. Do they still do that?
I don't know. That's a wonderful question. What I did when I was researching this is I took every biography off the shelf that the local research university for their wonderful library had to see just what everybody had to say about the will. And I looked at what A.L. Rouse had to say about the will. I won't go through it all, but I mean, there's a whole shelf of these people because they've been doing this for a lot of generations. And most of them say as little as they possibly can about this will.
Because it stands in such stark contrast to everything else that we attribute to this writer.
It's so bad.
It's not the most articulate will in the universe.
It's just deplorable.
Really?
It's terrible. Forgive me for saying it so straightforwardly, but for example, and it begins with a religious preamble. Now, about 90% of wills begin with a religious preamble because people were very religious in that time. Now, literary people and people who had educations compose their own, like we would compose a prayer. His is copied out of a formula book. And it is the bare bones formula. Most people, if they use a formula, they ad lib around it and kind of dress it up a little bit. This thing, I mean, that's for starters. And it goes.
Are you saying he downloaded a template from a website? Is that what's going on here?
Just about. Yeah, it was LegalZoom.com
right.
for the 16th century.
That's what you're sounding like.
Exactly. But I mean, you would expect better from somebody who was knowledgeable and erudite and this gloriously cultivated person that we're told that he was, and you see this will, and particularly as again, where I went through all these other wills, is to see it in comparison with what other people did.
So I have to ask you, Bonner, who did he leave the manuscripts of all of his plays to? Who did he leave all of his books to?
Yeah, who received his magnificent library, all of his source volumes and materials that
And
he
I know
based his
paper
works
was
on?
expensive at that time. So who got all of the paper and the pens and the shelves for the books? Who got all this
And
stuff?
of course, you're asking who was his literary executor.
Yeah,
Of course,
yeah,
there wasn't
yeah.
one.
There
and,
wasn't.
and of course, there was no mention of books. There was no mention of any type of item that would have anything to do with writing or education. There was no desk to write on. There was no pen or paper to write with. There were no musical instruments, which are part and parcel of actors and acting at the time. There's music all over the Shakespeare
He didn't
works.
leave his favorite quill to anyone?
He didn't seem to have a favorite quill.
I'm
no,
shocked.
he did not. Yes.
I'm sitting here shocked and agog.
But I'm curious. He retired in 1610, and he died around 1616. That means that after producing 37 plays and long narrative poems and 154 sonnets, he had 6 years where he didn't have to produce to anybody else's order. He must have, as a writer, as one of the most prolific writers in the world, he must have written something during those 6 years. What about his papers, his literary documents?
Where are his memoirs? The last 6 years what do you do for the last 6 years of your life? You must sit and write your memoirs.
Well, it's the only document from his life is this will that comes along at the last stages of his life, supposedly, and it gives you not a clue.
It must be
This
the
is
most
clueless.
eloquent will in the history of wills, then, right? Full of wonderful
Turns of the
phrase
phrase
and verbiage. I mean, the man
course.
had a vocabulary of 31,000 words in the Shakespearean canon. How many of those words did he use in his will?
You know, I'd wondered about that, but he has some phraseology in the will that I checked in the Harvard Concordance, and a lot of the verbiage in the will that deals with money lending, because we know he was a money lender, and it doesn't turn up one single time in the Shakespeare canon. So you're not even looking at the same vocabulary of this will. Well, and it's a very basic vocabulary. It's very limited. It's very repetitive, and this is what's in the will.
So what did he, Bonner, what did he leave?
What
did
was
he leave?
important to him then? What
Yeah.
was valuable to him that he left to his heirs?
Well, he was very well-to-do. I guess I would like to say he's rich. I think the best word for it is he was affluent. He owned 5 houses. And we can match. Some people find this will so bad that they wonder if it really is William Shakespeare. And yes, these 5 houses match the property that we know he purchased that's in the public record. So we definitely have the will of the person that is glorified and idealized as Shakespeare, except he leaves 5. He leaves all of his real estate to his daughter, Susanna, his older daughter, and he leaves 300 pounds, which would be the equivalent of about $300,000 to his younger daughter, Judith. And he spends a lot of time in the will dealing with, in fact, he's not a dummy totally. It's amazing this will is so bad because this person, there's a sort of underlying shrewd mentality, my money. And he's trying to get some money to his younger daughter who's just married somebody that he apparently doesn't like, and that's really quite okay. But he's encompassing this in these very rather complicated financial conditions so that the younger daughter will get the money and her husband that he doesn't like cannot get his hands on
So
it. That
one daughter gets the family homestead, the vacation house in Malibu, the house in Paris, the house on the Riviera, and the other daughter gets all the cash.
That's about right, yes. In fact, he leaves, now I added it up carefully, 370 pounds of cash bequest, 300 to the daughter and this other number of cash bequests, which is a lot of money to have in cash bequests. That would be, closing in on $500,000.
He has a lot of liquidity, man.
I'd
I'd like to have his portfolio.
And it's clear from how he words it that he's got the money. It's such in gold. That's he clearly he's wealthy. He's remarkably wealthy.
But you're talking about his daughter. He was married. What did he leave to his wife?
What did he leave to his wife?
Well, he managed.
She must have been rich.
You would think he would have taken good care of her because he had the means to do it. But however, he does not say where she will live as he is supposed to. He doesn't indicate what she will have to live on, the income that she would have for her maintenance to provide for her. All he leaves her is his second best bed. And this has been a very sticky thing with people historically because it appears to be an insult. And yes, the answer is yes, it is an insult. And it appears that he is using the second best bed, just like it was the proverbial shilling, where if you want to cut somebody off, you give them an item that is not substantial for their maintenance, an insubstantial item. And that's exactly what he does here. And that is the purpose of the second best bed.
Well, who got the first best bed?
Yeah, that's a good question.
It's a good joke. And everybody asks it, and he doesn't say. And that's very unusual, too.
Who gets to decide which is the best bed and which is the second best bed and which is the third best bed, I wonder?
Well, for a man who had...
Goldilocks? I mean, who tests these beds? That's what...
For a man who had a mansion home that is considered to have over 20 bedrooms, it had 10, the hearth taxes show that it had 10 chimneys, and you usually had 2 or 3 rooms per chimney. So it's generally thought that this mansion home had 20 bedrooms. So you would think that he may have had at least 20 best bed, best bed and the second and third and fourth and on down. But
that's
nobody,
a lot of beds.
But he doesn't say. Yes, he was living in a very big house, and you would think he would have been a little more specific than that.
So he doesn't leave his wife rights to his plays.
No.
He doesn't leave his wife rights to any of his poetry. What happened to those things?
As far as we know from the will, we have no clue. Mm-hmm. We do not know. Because he leaves not a word, not a whit, not a scrap of anything that would tell you what happened to any of this marvelous literature.
This is the mother of his children. This is the woman who bore him the famous son that he lost to an early death that he grieved over and apparently wrote an entire play about. He doesn't love this woman any more than that?
So it would seem.
Well, I'm just wondering out of this, if he didn't leave any of his theatrical stuff, if he didn't leave any of his writings, if he didn't leave any of his rights to things, if all he left to his wife was their second best bed, how do we know that this guy was a writer?
You wouldn't be able to tell it from the will. There's nothing in the will that indicates that this person was a writer of any kind. For example, I've read other wills where people have maps. The writer Shakespeare was an individual who sat many, many, many of his plays in foreign countries to which he never traveled. And you think he'd have maps, because maps were important items. He has no musical instruments. These are important items that are very important for actors, and in the music in Shakespeare is a very big deal. He has no paintings. He has.
What about his theatrical memorabilia? I mean, I'm a theater artist. I've been a theater artist since I was 9 years old. I started directing plays at the early age of 23. I have 126 productions under my belt, and I own something from every one of those productions. I keep, and much to my wife's chagrin, I have an entire shrine to my theatrical career in one bookshelf in one corner of our room. Not to mention my own library bookshelf that has all of my texts, all of my Shakespeare plays and complete work. I have 10 volumes of the complete works. Yes, I know it's excessive, but that's because that's what I do, and it's who I am. And if you walk into my home, you would immediately see the shrine of me in one corner of my house. Where's that stuff? Where's his playbills, his favorite costume, his wonderful set piece, that prop that he used in that production of Hamlet where he played the ghost that we've heard so much about?
There's nothing in the will that indicates, except for the interlineation of rings to 3 actors, which is interlined, in between the lines, crammed in between the lines, in the middle of the second page. That's the only thing that would give him the slightest theatrical connection. But even if that is a bona fide interlineation, it still doesn't.
It's a footnote.
Yeah. And it's so funny because we've now come to establish that this will is in 3 pages. And this interlineation is on page 2, and it's now quite clear. And even the Folger Shakespeare Library is finally admitting it, that these pages 2 and 3 came from an earlier time when he was still, if he was an actor, he was still supposedly a big man about town in London. He was still supposedly acting, and he's still supposedly writing plays, and he's still buying property, and yet he can't remember any of his acting friends except sticking them in a little tiny interlineation between the lines. That's it just doesn't really add up.
I remember when I read the will, I was fascinated by his division of the money so carefully, and this goes to the child, and if the child dies, then it goes to the first male son. And if that person dies, then it goes to the second male son of the second wife. Then it goes to the third. He goes on to 7 generations as to where the money is going to go. He's obsessed with money, isn't he?
Oh, he really is.
It's like a book of Genesis.
Yeah.
And then he begat, and then he begat, and then he begat.
Generations.
Yes.
I mean, but this guy was locked on money, not on culture, not on art, not on theater. Money. Is this Shakespeare?
It certainly doesn't sound like it. It's not the great-minded, great-souled person that we have been taught in schools with our professors and our English classes that we think that we know and we're sure that we love. No, it's not this. When you read the will, you do not see the image that you would expect to see from what you're taught.
Well, what I'm seeing is a businessman.
Absolutely.
And somebody is obsessed with making sure that
Yes.
whatever they leave goes unto 7 generations, and I'm not going to let it out of my family. I'm
Yes.
amazed that you say that there's nothing theatrical, no memorabilia, no plays, no discussion of that night at the Globe Theater, nothing.
It certainly does not sound like an artist of any ilk that I have ever come across in my life. In fact, what it sounds more like is a real estate mogul.
I would agree with that.
He sounds like a real estate mogul
tough-minded.
or even a banker. And he was, what was he? The money lending. What was he? The MasterCard of his day. I mean, that doesn't sound anything like a bleeding heart artist who has a passion for their art in whatsoever terms. It sounds to me more like somebody who prayed at the altar of cash.
It definitely does. He's quite absorbed.
Are we
with his
sure
money.
this is this guy's will? I mean, it just doesn't make any sense. Are we positive it's his?
And before we leave this, I want to be sure to point out that there's no mention of books in this will. And people who love books, Shakespeare, the writer, used for sources, as we know, hundreds of books. And these were rare books. These were important books. These were often books that weren't translated out of foreign languages. And these were valuable books for their time. And this individual doesn't even mention a book in his will.
He doesn't talk about his original copy in Italian of this source work or other, or the original copy in its original French of Montaigne,
Right.
or
Yes,
this
Montaigne's
copy,
essays, or Belfast.
or wait a minute.
Yeah.
Let's go to the one everybody knows is Ovid's Metamorphosis,
Metamorphosis,
right?
sure.
It's a huge source material. No one denies that for so many of the plays in the Shakespearean canon. Where is his original volume of Arthur Golding's English translation of Ovid's Metamorphosis?
Yes, I'd like to know. And if an English professor knew that, they would be a great hero. They at Harvard or Princeton or
The world.
Yes, the world, and Cambridge and Oxford and everywhere. They'd be carried around on people's shoulders, and they would be the greatest people celebrated in
And
the world today.
Susanna Shakespeare does not have it.
It doesn't appear that she
And
does.
Judith Shakespeare does not have it.
In fact, they have had a very intense investigation trying to find Shakespeare's library. I say they, it's through the centuries, by the 18th century, and it was really getting toward the end of the 18th century when you have Edmund Malone, who was one of the father of modern Shakespeare study, and he came on and he said, please, he put out a plea to people, to those of you who have old archives and who might have some books, you hear what I'm talking here, go through your archives and you can find stuff for him. He's got to have letters. He has no letters. He has no record of an education, but it's got to be there, so you just haven't looked hard enough.
Okay, so here's a very unique thing about Shakespeare the playwright that people talk about quite often, especially from a theatrical sense, is that there's such a minimal amount of stage direction in his plays. And it's because the stage direction in the plays that is given to the actor is actually in the meter and in the punctuation of the plays. If you know how to do what we call scansion in the theater world, if you know how to do your proper Shakespearean scansion, you find all these clues, all this hidden subtext, all these hidden instructions to the actors on how to deliver this word, where the stress goes, where to make a pause. Perhaps in his will, there's this secret code within the punctuation of the will that we're just not reading, that we're not getting. Is that possible?
It's not possible because this will, in its original form, has not a single mark of punctuation in the entire 3 pages.
Get out of town.
Nothing.
Not, it's totally one run-on sentence from the very first word to the very last word on 3 pages.
And English professors everywhere aren't going crazy and putting a big red F on that and sending it back for revision?
I have a question. Stephen, you mentioned Montaigne. We all know that Shakespeare knew his Montaigne probably through the translation of John Florio. I went and looked up Florio's will because I wanted something to compare with Shakespeare's will.
Sure.
And I thought, well, let's see what somebody who can't write like Florio, he's an Italian, and he says things like, I give and bequeath unto my daughter the wedding ring wherewith I married her mother, being aggrieved at my very heart that by reason of my poverty I'm not able to leave her anything else. And then he goes on and he says, I leave to Lord William, Earl of Pembroke, listen to this, Bonner, all my Italian, French, and Spanish books, as well as printed and unprinted books, being in number about 340, including my new and perfect dictionary, my 10 dialogues, unbound volume. This is somebody who Shakespeare knew. This was not Shakespeare. I'm baffled by the connection here between Shakespeare of Stratford, who writes one long sentence as a will.
That takes 3 pages, by the way.
And this man, John Florio.
It's a 3-page sentence.
And this man, John Florio, who writes eloquently, elegantly, leaves books, leaves papers, leaves love to his wife and his family. There's a problem there with identifying Shakespeare as the author of the will you're talking about.
Don, that quote that you just read there from Florio's will and testament includes a testament.
Mm-hmm.
It sounds like this will, this will by will, has no testament. It's just a will. There is no testament. There aren't these statements about I'm so sad that I'm poor, or that I'm so happy that I'm rich, or that I leave this item for this person because of my emotional feeling for them or my attachment for them. There's no passion whatsoever.
The man from Stratford has written an account book.
That's exactly
when I
right.
die, here's my account book, and take this much and this unto the 4th generation and the 5th generation, whereas other writers, people like Florio, are articulate and eloquent and are saying, my books are important, my wife is important. We don't get any of that humanity.
You would think that at the very minimum he
will.
would say, I leave my second bed best to my wife because I hate that woman. Or something.
Just a little bit of something that would give you some emotion. In fact, you're totally right. It is completely devoid of anything that gives you the slightest spark of feeling and humanity and compassion. And here's the thing: you read from a will by that John Florio wrote, and of course he was a very literary person. But I've read through all these thousands of wills, and ordinary people showed compassion and love in their wills, and they did it all the time. They left money for education, which Mr. Stratford doesn't do, Mr. Shakespeare Stratford does not do. And they would say they wanted to give money for a headmaster for a school who would teach poor men's children to read and write. There's nothing, people understood the value of education, and they left money for things to help to improve their community. They left money for roads and bridges. They left money for repairs of the church. This man does nothing along those orders.
Philanthropy.
Philanthropy.
People often include philanthropy in their estate planning,
and they do it in such a way that shows they have a heart.
One of the things that they generally leave money to is some cause that was important to them in their life, and oftentimes it's if they're an alum of a certain school, they leave money to that school. I mean, universities make a ton of money off of their alumnus leaving them money in their wills, right? Some people leave it to PETA because animals are their thing. What was his thing that he left any money to?
You won't find it in the will. And in fact, the
Nothing.
lack of philanthropy. Now, he did leave 10 pounds to the poor of Stratford, which he puts the poor of Stratford aforesaid because he's already mentioned that he's from Stratford. But he has it's not encompassed in language that gives the slightest inkling that he has any sense of or feeling for the townspeople of Stratford, who are supposedly certainly his neighbors and supposedly his friends.
So
you
some more
said
template there.
In today's dollars, how much was he leaving ultimately?
What was his net worth?
Yeah.
Well, I've actually discussed that with Tony Poynton. Now, that's a name that those of us in this study understand, but Dr. Poynton in England did a lot of study on that, and we talked about it. He believes his estate was valued at about £2,000, which would be $2 million. He carefully looked at all the property, and he did comparative studies on what it was worth and all the money that he had, and I agree with Dr. Poynton. In fact, historians say that a person is regarded as middling rich if their estate was between 200 and 500 pounds. So at 2,000, this man has 4 times the amount of money of just a relatively well-off person.
And he made all that money off of the royalties from his plays and off the ticket sales at the theater, right? That's how he made all that money?
That's what an English professor will tell you. But there's no.
But how did he really make all that money?
I believe he made it primarily both through his businesses and through his money lending activities, because we know he was a money lender. There are no letters that he wrote to anyone.
Wait a minute. Whoa, wait a minute.
Right.
The guy who is the father of the English language never wrote a letter?
Not that posterity has.
Not even to his lawyer, like, hey, come over, I need to write a will?
No.
How about contracts for plays? Surely there's lots of contracts to this man in Stratford for plays, and that would be part of his documents.
Not that anybody's been able to find, and it isn't for want of trying, as there are many reports in history of people who were so sure they would find things, and they went to the Public Record Office and they went through literally millions of documents, and they came up empty-handed. They did not find anything that you're asking, do they have? No, they don't.
This man in Stratford, whose name was Shakspere and not Shake-Spear, anything like that. This man in Stratford seems to have created the will of a businessman, right? And
Yes.
and that's what this is proving, not really the will of a theater person with memorabilia, a loving husband, a humanist, none of those things. I know, Bonnie, you're also very interested in the authorship question, and that you come down on the side of the Earl of Oxford, Edward de
Wait,
Vere.
the Earl of who?
The 17th Earl of Oxford.
Oh, that guy.
That one, yeah, Edward de Vere. Now, I'm very curious. Edward de Vere had a superb education. He traveled. He did all of these things. Edward de Vere must have left a really superb will.
Well, that's a very interesting question, because we do not have a will from Edward de Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford.
Nothing at all.
Nothing. And by the way, that's not so terribly unusual as it sounds. We don't have a will from the Earl of Southampton, which is very striking. People have searched to see if Edward de Vere left a will, and fine archivists have searched, and they've come up empty-handed. So as far as we know, Edward de Vere did not leave a will. Too bad, because we would love to know what our guy would have left in a testamentary type of
but
document.
wait a minute. The first folio that has the great collection, I believe 23 of the 37 plays come into the first folio when it's published. The first folio is dedicated to 2 men.
Yes.
2 sons-in-law. Are they the husbands of Susanna and Judith Shakspere?
Wouldn't that be lovely for the?
Because that's sort of a will. Isn't that sort of a will and testament?
Yes,
isn't? I
for the
dedicate
loyal
this.
opposition in academia, if they could be so happy if something like that were the case. As I think you're kind of hinting at the 2 noblemen to whom the first folio is dedicated, and many think that they very probably underwrote the expense of the first folio, because it was a very expensive undertaking. And it's dedicated to 2 noblemen. Edward de Vere had actually 3 daughters, and the Shakespeare canon had 3 patrons. First was Southampton, and I won't go into the details now. But
And his will is missing.
His will is missing.
Very curious.
It is amazing. Then the 2 noblemen, earls, who underwrote the first folio, to whom it's dedicated. They were the Earls of Pembroke and the Earls of Montgomery. Actually, for Oxford's three daughters, daughter number one was supposed to marry the Earl of Southampton. Daughter number two it was on the table for her, daughter number two to marry the Earl of Pembroke, but the third marriage is the one that did make it, and they had apparently a very successful marriage because they had 10 kids.
Wow.
So
They were busy.
And it was
Those nobles
through-
were busy.
It was through that family that we have the first folio, because they were the sponsors of it. They were the ones involved.
the first
Yes.
folio of Shakespeare's works was not dedicated to anyone connected to Shakespeare of Stratford, but instead was dedicated to men who are connected to the Earl of Oxford.
That's exactly right. Yes.
And the Earl of Oxford's will is mysteriously missing. The Earl of Southampton, to whom the sonnets are dedicated, his will is mysteriously missing.
The Earl of Southampton is also the dedicatee of the first two Shakespeare poems, isn't he? Venus and Adonis
Yeah.
and The Rape of Lucrece.
Yes.
Yeah, very, very curious gaps in our history, isn't it?
How would this guy
is.
from Stratford even know the Earl of Southampton? How would he know the Earl of Pembroke? How would he know the Earl of Montgomery? How would he know any of these people?
Well, in fact, those Orthodox scholars and researchers have spent years of their life pouring through millions of documents trying to answer that very question, and they've come up empty-handed. They have not found a whit of any sort of evidence or documents that can show how Mr. Shakespeare of Stratford ever met the Earl of Southampton or the Earl of Pembroke or the Earl of Montgomery. And it's so funny because in those dedications for those two poems that you just mentioned, it's clear that Shakespeare, whoever he is, who's dedicating this stuff to Southampton, loves Southampton. Southampton is beloved by Shakespeare. It is tough to be beloved by someone you never meet.
Who died first, Southampton or Shakespeare of Stratford?
Shakespeare of Stratford.
And he didn't leave anything to Southampton
No.
in his will?
No.
Does he mention Southampton in his will?
No.
The guy he dedicated his first two poems to, he doesn't mention in his will?
No.
Oh, I smell a rat.
Yeah, there's something rotten in the state of Denmark here.
Yeah,
I'm
there's something
not
rotten in
sure.
Stratford here. That's what I say.
Well, it seems to me that the whole authorship question certainly can't be solved if you're looking at Shakespeare's will, his accounting book, when he died, but it just opens up more and more questions. It's really a fascinating subject.
I'd go so far as to say that it eliminates him as a candidate for the authorship. It's his last will and testament. It is the final statement of his life. And if in the final statement of his life, all he cared about was property, gold, and offending his wife, that's not the same guy. Specifically, and let's talk about like in modern times right now, in the day and age that we're in, you're talking about a man who, on the one hand, wrote characters like Portia in Merchant of Venice, who becomes this magnificent lawyer in disguise. Rosalind in As You Like It, who is basically a love guru in disguise. Other female characters like Juliet, who stands up to her father because she wants to marry the man she really loves as opposed to this arranged marriage. These are these very strong, empowered, and you might even argue the author of these works is the very first literary feminist. But that's the same guy who then in his will says, I leave my wife the second best bed because I hate that woman. That's not the same man. It seems to me impossible that could be the same man.
And another thing is his two daughters were illiterate. His older daughter has a very scrawl signature on a document, and his
Shut
younger
the front
daughter
door.
and his younger daughter has what's called the pig's tail signature. All she could do was a couple of loops,
A squiggle?
a squiggle.
She does a squiggle.
So this man who creates all these fabulous female characters wasn't able to educate his own daughters. His wife must have been very literate, yes?
Well, apparently, everyone who surrounded him that in his family were illiterate. His parents were illiterate. His wife was illiterate. His daughters were illiterate. I mean, he's surrounded by illiterate people. And that's what has always bothered me a little bit, because you would think someone who managed to achieve this phenomenal literary accomplishment and genius, it could have brushed off a little bit on the people who lived with him in his own home.
I think we're looking in the wrong town for the real Shakespeare.
I have 2 little girls of my own, and I can tell you that I take great pride in the fact that they are learning as much as they are learning, and learning to become empowered young women. And it is my hope and goal that that will continue throughout their lives. I can't imagine that an artist, someone with the kind of passion that obviously the writer of these works had, the creativity and the ability to thwart the system and buck society in creating these magnificently powerful female characters, would fail to educate his own daughters, fail to teach them to even be able to read his own works and enjoy these characters. Why would you create Portia and then deprive Portia from your own daughters? Why would you create Rosalind? Why would you create Juliet and then deprive your own daughters of the glory of reading about these women? That doesn't make any sense to me.
It's totally baffling and flabbergasting, and it's so far out of line with what anyone would imagine could be the case. When you start looking for something and you're digging in the wrong place, that's where you find this person who didn't educate his own children. Obviously, whoever is writing these plays, our real guy had to be caring about other people and caring about their education. And one of the things about getting back to the will real quickly, he leaves nothing for the Stratford Grammar School. There's no one in Stratford-upon-Avon who is educated because of his efforts. He leaves nothing to the school. He needs nothing for the education of anyone. And there's no other records that show that he ever did care about the education of anyone. Not his own children, not his own family, and no one in the community in which he lived.
So there's no line in there, I leave this many pounds to the Stratford School, go Mustangs. There's go Spear Shakers.
Yeah, or go Globe Thespians. I mean, there's not a word. I mean, this is a man who dominated the theater, who retires, and 6 years later he dies, and there's not a word about the Globe in the will. There's not a word about the theater in the will. There's not a word about, I understand maybe he didn't have the text of the plays that the actors used, but he wrote the plays. He has to have a rough manuscript. Nothing.
Some sort of notebook, some sort of diaries,
Yeah.
and people who would want to come to sit at the foot of the master and commune with him on the wonderful culture that they know about. And no, there's none of that.
To my favorite director of my plays, I leave my costume collection. There's nothing.
Nothing.
Nothing
Not
like
at all.
that. I go back to what I said before. I think people who look to the will of William Shakespeare of Stratford to find some proof of the humanity and brilliance of the writer William Shakespeare were probably looking in the wrong place. And I can understand fully why so many people are moving toward the what is called the authorship question, to try to figure out, well, if it wasn't Shakespeare of Stratford, who was it? And what were their lives like? And I go back to what I said to you before, Bonner. I would look toward the Earl of Oxford's will or Southampton's will. And isn't it curious that those legal documents have disappeared? Very curious to me.
So, Don, you hit it on the head. I think it's beyond if you're looking at the will of Will Shakespeare of Stratford. I think if you're looking in Stratford, you're looking in the wrong place.
Mm-hmm.
And the people in Stratford may not like to hear that, but the bottom line is they got the wrong guy, they got the wrong place, and they certainly got the wrong will. And I mean that in both contexts. See what I did there? That was like a Shakespearean double entendre.
That was great. That was great. And when he died, no one noticed. No one in Stratford noticed, other than they write in the church record that he's buried. But no one. There are no tributes to him as a writer. No one in London seems to notice. It's his death is completely,
Did anyone come
non-event.
knocking? Does anyone come knocking? Does anyone show up in Stratford going, I want my share, or he promised me this, or where is his library, or where are his books? Does anybody, when somebody wealthy dies, people come out of the woodwork, right? Suddenly relatives pop up out of everywhere. Oh, he promised me I would get
how about
this.
celebrity? Never mind wealth.
Sure.
A celebrity dies, everybody would pour into that town and say, I want his cloak, I want his this, I want it. Nothing.
Did they do a giant
nothing.
festival of his plays in Stratford upon his death to glorify him, to celebrate him?
It took 150 years before they finally figured that out. Yes, eventually they had a Shakespeare Jubilee, but that was in another century and a half before things started to congeal, and this elusive figure people start to realize that, they might have something here. And one of the ways they really celebrated it, we're now 150 years in the future, the rumor was he had once planted a mulberry tree. And then there was this huge outpouring of people who wanted relics and trinkets. And so the townspeople of Stratford figured that out. And they started just carving little curios and things. The tourist industry, started small, but people came and they wanted the curios and they wanted the things that were made, the little carvings and figurines from the mulberry tree, which as people finally realized you could build a whole navy out of them, out of wood. That had this one little mulberry tree.
This is a piece of the true cross. That's kind of
exactly
reminds me.
right.
Well, you see,
And
Shakespeare,
it really got going well.
Shakespeare would be happy with that, that he made money for his town and money for his people. It seems to me that for a businessman to make money for his town, that's what it's about. He's happy somewhere, but it has very little to do with who actually wrote the plays of Shakespeare.
And I know that today we live in a time where media and whatnot is very instant. Here we are sitting here doing a podcast, and people all over the world can have access to this within moments of us completing it and uploading it to a site. And I get that wasn't the case back then. However, when you think about the thing that comes to mind, the one most recent that I can think of as far as celebrity is Burt Reynolds died not too long ago. And it was like within a day or two that suddenly all over the networks, TNT and A&E and the movie channel, suddenly all these Burt Reynolds films were popping up all over the place when you went on to your cable provider. And there was Cannonball Run, there was Smokey and the Bandit.
But you didn't get the equivalent in Stratford upon Avon when Shakespeare died. You got nothing.
Exactly my point.
Died.
Like, you would think that at the very minimum they'd go, hey, we should put on a production of Hamlet to honor him. It was his greatest work.
Or you say the Globe Theatre in London finds out that Shakespeare died. They would immediately do a season of Shakespeare.
How long could it have taken for them to know? I mean,
Nothing.
even if by horseback it took, I don't know how far away. It's like 30 miles. Like how long by horseback? You would think it would have been like Paul Revere riding in, Shakespeare is dead, Shakespeare is dead.
Yeah.
And the whole town would have gone into wearing black and mourning.
You would think, but there would be an outpouring, but there wasn't. There wasn't so much. In fact, I must quote Justice John Paul Stevens when he wrote about this, that he said it's the dog that didn't bark. And he said, you'd think at least you'd get a dachshund.
A Chihuahua, maybe.
Or Chihuahua. Somebody would notice some little something and no.
Not a peep.
Yeah, not a peep.
So the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust is making a lot of money on tourism to Stratford upon Avon. I have one question, Bonner. If it were found out somehow that, let's say, the Earl of Oxford, who came from Essex, was the real author, do you think that would destroy tourism to Stratford upon Avon? Or would it just add another location for Shakespeare lovers to go to?
Well, a number of people have thought about that, and actually they feel that because Stratford is a lovely town and because it's invested so much in its Renaissance, the beautiful the infrastructure and the architecture, and they've made a lovely Renaissance town, that actually they can make a transition, and it could still be where the Royal Shakespeare Company has a major performing venue. It could still be a major place for tourists to go to see what Renaissance England was like, and so that there's really room for the both of them.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's really that. A lot of people. This isn't original with me. I've heard different people say that, but I'm totally on board with that. I believe that they need to just start doing some rethinking, and that they can accommodate this thing.
Yeah,
there would be one major difference. They would no longer be able to say, and this is where Anne Hathaway slept in the second best bed.
Yeah.
Yes, and they'd have to maybe do a little something with Anne Hathaway's cottage, but they could figure that out.
Yes.
Yeah, I think the
Definitely.
British can be pretty good at multiple tourism locations
Yes,
for Shakespeare.
I think there's room enough for the both of them.
Well, this has been a most enjoyable and enlightening conversation. I'm going to go home and write up a will.
and I hope-
I'm going to write one big, long, run-on sentence, 3 pages long, because that's what the master of the English language did, and so I should do the same.
Yeah, I've never had so much fun talking about death and wills and legal things. Thank you, Bonnet. This is great. Thank you, Steve.
Thank you guys for being here on this episode of Don't Quill the Messenger, revealing the truth about Shakespeare authorship. Once again, our honored guests, Professor Don Rubin and Bonner Miller Cutting, the world's leading expert on Elizabethan wills. If you want to learn more, please visit ShakespeareOxfordFellowship.org. That's ShakespeareOxfordFellowship.org. It is your resource and source for answers to all your questions about the Shakespeare authorship mystery. I'm Stephen Sable, your host. Join us for future episodes of Don't Quill the Messenger, and please give us a rate and a review. And remember, keep asking questions.
If you've enjoyed today's episode, please leave a rating and review in your podcast player. For even more, visit our website, don'tquillthepodcast.com. There you can find official merchandise in our shop, as well as a link to our Patreon. This show is made possible by people like you. We hope you'll consider showing your support by becoming a monthly patron, where you'll receive bonus material and tons of exclusive perks. You can also join in the conversation on our Discord and by following us at Don't Quill the Pod on all social media. All of this can be found at don'tquillthepodcast.com, don'tquillthepodcast.com.
It's Dragon Wagon.